She spent 4 months building the evidence to kill him, but tonight, as Kaylin Voss's gun pointed directly at the man kneeling in a pool of blood on the Brooklyn Bridge, she realized she had hunted the wrong prey. The real killer was right behind her, and he wore an FBI badge. If you're watching this video, please like, comment your city name below so I know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will change everything. The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight. Not the kind of rain that cleaned things. New York rain never cleaned anything. It just moved the dirt around, pushed it into gutters and subway drains and the spaces between things where people stopped looking. Kaylin Voss stood at the window of her apartment on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like mildew and old cooking grease, watching the street below dissolve into rivers of black water and neon light. She hadn't slept in 31 hours. She could feel it behind her eyes, that specific grinding pressure that made everything look slightly wrong, slightly tilted, like the world had shifted 2 degrees off its axis and nobody had bothered to tell her. Her phone buzzed on the desk behind her. She didn't move. On the desk beside the phone sat 4 months of work. Photographs, surveillance logs, financial records, testimonies from witnesses who had agreed to talk only after she'd promised them things she wasn't sure the FBI could actually deliver. Lucien Vale's entire operation mapped out on paper and corkboard, connected by red string like something out of a detective movie, except this wasn't a movie. The women were real, 23 names, 23 lives that had disappeared into the machinery of New York's underground, and the only thread connecting all of them led back to a man in a tailored black suit who ran a nightclub called Obsidian Saint off a side street in Lower Manhattan. She finally turned from the window and picked up the phone. Tomorrow night. You're going in, Deputy Director Adrian Wolfe, her mentor, the man who had plucked her from a dead-end position in the Detroit field office 6 years ago and told her she had a gift, that she could read people the way most agents read case files, could feel the spaces between what someone said and what they meant. He'd built her career around that gift. She'd given everything to justify his belief in her. She typed back, "I'll be ready." She set the phone down and looked at the photograph pinned at the center of the corkboard. Lucien Vale stepping out of a black car on a street slicked with last week's rain. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm. It came from control. From a man who had learned a long time ago that the less he moved, the more people feared him. The serpent tattoos curling up his throat were barely visible at this distance, but Kaylin had studied them in closer photographs, had memorized the way they coiled like they were alive, like they were waiting. She'd spent 4 months studying this man from a safe distance. Tomorrow she'd be pouring his whiskey. She pulled her jacket off the back of the chair and sat down on the edge of her bed. The only piece of furniture in the apartment that didn't belong to the FBI provided cover identity, and stared at the floor for a long time. 23 women. She made herself say their names. Quietly, in the empty room, with the rain hammering the window and the city making its endless noise 7 stories below. She said every name because they deserved to be more than files, more than evidence, more than the raw material of a prosecution. When she finished, she lay back on the bed without taking off her clothes and waited for a sleep that didn't come. Obsidian Saint did not look like a place where people died. That was the first thing Kaylin noticed when she walked in for her first shift as a bartender. Her cover identity solid, her background story practiced until it lived in her muscle memory rather than her conscious mind. The club was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful when someone is trying very hard to make you forget what they cost. Violet and black lighting draped everything in shadow and suggestion. The music was low and textured, something without lyrics, just rhythm and bass that you felt in your sternum before you heard it. The bar stretched the entire length of the east wall, dark wood and polished steel, and the bottles behind it were arranged with an almost military precision that told Kaylin someone with a controlling nature had put them there. The clientele looked like money, not new money. New money was loud and careless. These were people who wore their wealth like a second skin, people who had learned to exist in expensive rooms without looking like they were trying to belong. Politicians Kaylin recognized from briefing room photographs. 2 men she was almost certain were connected to a financial firm currently under federal investigation for securities fraud. A woman in a red dress who had testified before Congress 3 years ago about cybersecurity threats, and apparently hadn't considered it a contradiction to spend her Thursday nights in a nightclub operated by a suspected serial killer. Kaylin poured drinks and watched and said nothing that wasn't necessary. The other bartender was a lean, watchful man named Dre, who had the eyes of someone who'd grown up checking exits before he checked menus, showed her the routine without asking questions. That was its own kind of signal. In normal jobs, people ask questions. In places like this, learning not to ask them was part of the job. She was 3 hours into her shift when she first saw Lucian Vale in person. He came in from a door behind the bar, not the main entrance, and the effect on the room was subtle but immediate. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted. People angled themselves differently. A particular kind of alertness moved through the club like a current, and Kaylin felt it even though she was watching the bottles she was arranging rather than the door. She looked up. He was worse in person. Not in the way she'd expected. She'd expected something crude, something that confirmed the profile. Instead, he was precise. Every element of his presentation was deliberate. The suit, the posture, the way his eyes moved across the room in a sweep that cataloged everything before he'd taken 3 steps. The serpent tattoos were hidden tonight by a collar buttoned to the throat, but she knew they were there, and knowing made the back of her neck prickle. His eyes found her, not in a predatory way. She'd been stared at by predatory men, knew that particular quality of attention, the way it assessed and inventoried and reduced. This was different. This was the look of a man who noticed that something in his environment had changed and was filing the information away without yet deciding what to do with it. She held his gaze for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to not look afraid, short enough to not look challenging, and then went back to the bottles. When she looked up again, he was gone. The first 3 weeks were a lesson in patience. Kaylin poured whiskey for men she recognized from FBI most wanted lists and kept her face neutral. She listened to conversations she wasn't supposed to hear and retained every word, every name, every oblique reference that might mean something to someone with the right context. She filed it all away in the part of her mind that Wolf had always called her best weapon, her memory for pattern, for the tiny discrepancies between what people said in comfort and what they said when they thought no one capable of understanding was listening. She called in reports to her handler twice a week from a burner phone she kept in a locker at a gym 6 blocks away. The reports were careful, thorough, and completely clean. She had a gift for presenting information without revealing how it had been obtained, another skill Wolf had cultivated in her. Lucian Vale watched her. Not constantly, not obviously, but she felt the attention the way you felt a change in air pressure before a storm. He never addressed her directly, never made a move that would justify concern or a report. But she noticed the way his people moved around her, giving her a slightly wider berth than necessary, including her in the peripheral edges of conversations that should have excluded a bartender entirely. He was assessing her. That was fine. She was assessing him. What troubled her was that the assessment wasn't matching the profile. Serial predators operated from need, from an internal compulsion that eventually overrode their capacity for control. The profile on Vale described a man who used his position and resources to select, isolate, and eliminate women who had crossed into his criminal orbit, women who had seen too much or threatened exposure. The killings were attributed to him through circumstantial chains. Women last seen at Obsidian Saint, women connected to his organization, women whose disappearances clustered around key moments in his criminal operation. But circumstantial chains could be built around anyone with enough proximity to the right crimes. Kaylin knew that. She'd known it when she took the assignment. She'd chosen to set it aside because Wolf believed Vale was responsible, and in 6 years she'd never seen Wolf be wrong about something this significant. On the last Friday of her 3rd week, Lucian Vale came to the bar, sat down on a stool across from her and said, "You've been watching the exits." She didn't flinch. Habit. From what? Bartending in places that don't have good security. He studied her. Up close, his eyes were darker than photographs suggested. Not black, but a very deep brown that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. There was no warmth in them, but there was intelligence. Considerable intelligence. The kind that had learned to disguise itself as indifference because intelligence made people nervous. "You don't act like someone who needs the money," he said. "Everyone needs money, not the way you carry yourself." He tapped the bar once with 2 fingers, a gesture that seemed unconscious, habitual. "You carry yourself like someone with options, People who need money don't have options. They have this job and the next one. Maybe I like this job. Why? She poured him a drink he hadn't asked for, his usual, which she'd memorized his second night, and slid it across the bar. Good lighting. Interesting clientele. He looked at the glass, then back at her. You've been watching the clientele. I told you. Habit. Something moved through his expression, too fast to name, too controlled to read. Then he picked up the glass and stood. Don't watch them too closely, he said. It wasn't a threat. That was what made it alarming. It was a warning, and warnings came from people who believed you were in danger from a source they understood, and you didn't. She watched him walk away and felt the hair on her arms stand up. 3 nights later, she found the basement. It happened by accident, or what she initially took for accident, though she would later question every element of how it unfolded. A fight broke out near the east hallway, 2 men from one of the private booths taking an argument physical with the sudden, graceless violence of men who were drunk and had too much to prove. Security moved in fast and hard, and in the reshuffling of bodies and the general chaos of the moment, Kaylin found herself near the door at the end of the east hallway. The door she'd noted her first night, the one that had no signage, no visible lock, no reason to exist in a nightclub unless it led somewhere the nightclub didn't advertise. The door was open. An inch. No more. But it was open. She looked behind her. The fight had drawn everyone's attention to the main floor. Dre was up on the bar calling for calm. Security was occupied. She had maybe 30 seconds before the situation resolved and eyes started moving again. She pushed the door open and went through. The stairs went down. The smell hit her first. Not what she'd expected. She'd been braced for the specific wrongness of a room where violence had been done. That copper and chemical smell that never entirely left a space no matter how thoroughly it was cleaned. She'd been in rooms like that. She knew what they smelled like. This smelled like food and coffee, and the particular staleness of air recycled too many times in a sealed space, like an office building after hours or a shelter. She went down. The basement was large, larger than the footprint of the club above suggested, which meant it extended under the adjacent building, possibly further. The lights were dim but functional. Along the walls, rough partitions had been built, dividing the space into sections. In the first section, she could see cots, blankets, personal items, a jacket hung on a nail, a photograph taped to the rough wood partition, a pair of shoes placed carefully beneath the cot's edge. Someone lived here. Multiple someones. Kaylin moved deeper, and the first person she saw was a woman sitting at a folding table, drinking coffee from a paper cup, reading a dog-eared paperback novel. The woman looked up. She was in her 30s, thin in the way that came from stress rather than intention, with the careful alertness of someone who'd learned to assess threats quickly. She didn't scream, she didn't run, she just looked at Kaylin with the flat, measuring gaze of someone who had been surprised before and survived it. "You're new," the woman said. Kaylin stood very still. "I work upstairs." "I know. I've seen you." The woman closed her book, keeping her thumb in the page, Kaylin noticed, like she expected to go back to it shortly. "Lucian said there was someone new, said she watched everything." "Who are you?" The woman's name was Petra. She'd gone missing 14 months ago, was on the FBI's list of victims attributed to Lucian Vale, was listed in the case file Kaylin had built as one of the women believed dead, believed to have been killed in the first months of Vale's alleged predation pattern. She was alive. She was sitting in a basement beneath a nightclub drinking coffee and reading a novel. She was not alone. In the next 20 minutes, Kaylin found 11 women. Not all awake, some were asleep, some were in a second room she hadn't seen at first, that had been set up as something closer to a proper living space, with a table, chairs, a small television running on mute. All of them had names that Kaylin recognized. All of them were listed as missing. Several were listed as presumed dead. None of them looked like prisoners. One of them, a young woman named Celestine who had gone missing from a trafficking case in Queens 8 months ago, made Kaylin coffee without being asked and explained in a flat, practiced voice that she was waiting, that they were all waiting, that Lucien was building something against the people who had taken them, and until that something was ready, This was the safest place in New York. Kaylin had asked, safest from what? And Celestine had said, from the people inside your building. Inside your building. The FBI building on Federal Plaza. Kaylin drove back to her apartment that night with her hands perfectly steady on the wheel and her mind cycling through the same sequence on loop. She didn't call her handler. She didn't call Wolf. She sat in her car in the parking garage beneath her building for 45 minutes, engine off, rain drumming on the concrete above her, and let herself feel the specific terror of a person who has just realized that the map they've been navigating by might be completely wrong. Then she went upstairs and waited. Lucien found her at the bar the next night. He didn't sit this time. He stood on the other side of the bar and waited until the nearest customers were out of earshot, and then he said very quietly, "You went downstairs." "Yes." And I want to understand what I saw." He looked at her for a long time. That same cataloging assessment, but different now. More direct. Like he'd been waiting for this particular conversation and was deciding how to have it. "How much do you know about the Graves Wolf network?" The name hit her like cold water. She kept her face still. "I don't know what that is." "Yes, you do." He put both hands on the bar and leaned forward slightly. "You're federal. I've known since your third shift. The question I've been asking myself is whether you know what you're actually part of." She didn't confirm, didn't deny, just held his gaze and waited. Because that was the play, the only play. When someone had just turned your entire operational situation inside out, and you needed to know how much they actually had before you gave them anything more. Lucien reached under the bar. She tensed, her hand moving fractionally toward her ankle, and produced a manila folder. He set it on the bar between them. "Read it," he said. "Not here. Take it home. Read it tonight." "Why would I trust anything you give me?" "Because the women downstairs are alive," he said. "And because whoever briefed you on this case told you they were dead." He straightened up, tugged his jacket straight with a small, precise movement. "Either your people got it wrong, or your people lied to you. Either way, you've got a problem." He paused. "That folder is evidence, real evidence. What you do with it is your choice, but I'd make the choice fast." "Fast why?" His eyes were completely flat. "Because the order to move on this operation came through 3 days ago. They're not waiting anymore." He walked away before she could ask who they were. She took the folder home. She read it. By 3 in the morning, she understood that the case she'd been building for 4 months had been constructed around her, that every thread of evidence pointing to Lucien Vale had been carefully, expertly placed by someone who understood exactly how federal investigations worked, because that someone worked inside them. 14 years of financial records, surveillance documentation, communications intercepts that pointed not at a nightclub owner using his empire to commit predation, but at a federal operation using its investigative authority to identify and eliminate witnesses to a trafficking network so deeply embedded in American power that its exposure would collapse careers from Washington to Wall Street. Deputy Director Adrian Wolf was named throughout. His signature, his communications, his operational fingerprints on 11 separate murders currently attributed to Lucien Vale. But Wolf wasn't running it. The folder contained one additional name, circled in red ink, with a single notation beneath it, 15 years. Everything goes through her. Assistant Director Evelyn Graves. Kaylin sat at her desk as the city went gray with early morning and understood that she had spent 4 months hunting a man who was protecting the women her own organization was trying to kill. She understood that she had been selected for this assignment not because of her abilities, but because of her relationship with Wolf. Because her conviction in his integrity would make her investigation cleaner, more credible, harder to challenge. She had been the instrument. She stared at the folder until her eyes burned. Then her phone rang. It was Wolf. "Tomorrow night," he said. "We're moving on Vale. Full tactical. I need you in position on the bridge by 10. She said, "I'll be there." She hung up the phone. Outside, New York was beginning its morning. The slow, indifferent machinery of 8 million people starting another day without the faintest idea that the woman sitting at the desk by the window had just had everything she believed about her life rearranged into something she didn't yet have words for. She didn't sleep. She sat and stared at the folder and thought about 23 names and 11 women in a basement and a man with serpent tattoos who had handed her the evidence to destroy her own career and possibly her own life. She thought about what Celestine had said. From the people inside your building. By the time the city was fully awake, Kaylin Voss had made a decision that she understood, with complete clarity, would change the rest of her life. She wasn't going to that bridge to arrest Lucy. Oh, she was going to warn him. The bridge came at night, as bridges always do in stories that end with water. Rain hammered the steel cables and turned the East River into something black and moving and indifferent to the drama happening above it. Kaylin arrived early, moved to the position Wolf had specified, mid-span, near the pedestrian barrier, and waited with her weapon drawn and the cold so deep in her bones it felt like it had always been there. Lucien arrived exactly on time. He was already wounded, a cut along his jaw, a darkness on his left shoulder that she recognized as a bullet graze. He'd been moving fast through a city that was hunting him, and he'd arrived anyway. He stood in the rain and looked at her with those flat, dark eyes and didn't flinch at the weapon. "You came," he said. "I came to warn you," she said. "They're moving in 60 seconds. You need to—" The shot came from the north tower. It caught Lucien at the shoulder and spun him half around, and Kaylin was already moving toward him, not away, which was the choice that ended everything. Because she knew that shot had come from a federal position, and federal snipers didn't miss their first shot unless the first shot was meant to wound, meant to hold a target in place while the secondary team closed in, which meant the real target wasn't Lucien Vale at all. It was her. She'd read the folder. She knew too much. She was the loose end Wolf needed to close before the operation collapsed. Lucien grabbed her wrist as the second shot cracked the concrete inches from her head. She didn't hesitate. She went over the barrier with him. The river came up fast and black and freezing, and the last thing she heard before the water took her was the city screaming above. Sirens and rotors, and the particular sound of a world that had just been told a story it was going to believe, about a rogue federal agent and the man who'd corrupted her, about madness and manipulation and violence that required no further explanation. The water closed over her head. New York kept moving. And somewhere in the cold and the dark, and the current pulling them toward the harbor, Kaylin Voss understood that she was no longer an FBI agent. She was no longer the hunter. She was the hunted. And the only person in the world who might keep her alive was the man bleeding into the black water beside her, the man she'd spent 4 months trying to destroy. She kicked for the surface. She had no idea what was waiting when she got there, but she was going to find out. 48 hours earlier, she had still believed in the system. That version of her felt very far away now, like someone she'd read about in a case file, someone whose certainty she couldn't quite reach from here. The river carried them south through the darkness, away from the bridge and the gunfire and the story New York was already telling about them. And somewhere downstream, the city had no idea what was coming for it. The river spat them out near the Red Hook waterfront like something it had chewed on and decided it didn't want. Kaylin hit the concrete embankment shoulder first and lay there for a moment that felt longer than it was, pressing her cheek against wet stone while her body ran its damage report. Cold that had stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like nothing, the dangerous kind of nothing, the kind that meant the nerve endings had given up sending signals. Lungs that felt like wrung-out cloth. A cut somewhere above her hairline that she hadn't noticed until the blood started mixing with the river water dripping down her temple. She pushed herself up. Lucien was already standing. He was doing it the way people stand when standing is the only option, and not doing it is a form of dying, rigid from the shoulder down on his left side, one hand pressed flat against the wound that was still seeping through his fingers, his suit jacket torn at the collar where something had caught him in the water. He was looking at the skyline upriver. His face gave nothing away. That was the most unsettling thing about him. Not the blood, not the damage, but the absolute absence of panic in a man who had every right to it. "Can you move?" he said. "I'm moving," she said. "That's not what I asked." She got to her feet, her legs held. She did a quick inventory. Weapon gone, lost in the river, which left her with a backup piece at her ankle that had somehow survived the drop and the current. Phone gone. The folder was gone. Everything she had to prove any of what she knew was at the bottom of the East River or in a federal server farm or distributed across the hard drives of people who were currently being hunted. "I can move," she said. He looked at her then. That cataloging sweep. quick and clinical, like he was confirming the inventory she'd just done herself. His eyes stopped briefly on the cut above her hairline, on her hands, on the way she was distributing her weight. "There's a car," he said. "2 blocks. Blue Civic, 2019. Plates are clean. Key is in the wheel well." "Your car?" "My city." He started walking before she could respond. She followed because the alternative was standing on a wet embankment in Red Hook at 1 in the morning while the entire machinery of federal law enforcement reorganized itself around hunting her face. And that alternative was not viable. The Civic was where he said it would be. She drove. He didn't offer to, and she didn't ask. The left shoulder was bad enough that she could see him compensating every time she took a turn. His right hand braced against the dashboard in a way he probably thought was subtle. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of thing you did when you were trying to hold yourself together through physical anchor points because the alternative was coming apart. "Where am I going?" she said. "South. I'll tell you when to turn." "You need a hospital." "I need a lot of things. A hospital isn't one of them. Hospitals file reports." "If that shoulder isn't packed in the next hour, you're going to bleed out in my passenger seat." "Then you should drive faster." She drove faster. The city moved past them, wet and indifferent, lit in sodium orange and the cold blue of convenience stores, and the occasional pulse of an emergency vehicle going somewhere else. The radio was off. The silence between them had weight to it, had specific textures, her fury and her fear, and the particular vertigo of someone whose entire professional identity had just been dismantled in the span of 48 hours, and his something else. His silence was different. It was the silence of a man who had been waiting for this night for a long time and was now in the part of the operation that came after the plan and before the next plan and required a particular quality of patience. "You knew they were going to shoot me," she said. "I suspected." "That's not the same as telling me." He didn't answer immediately. She glanced at him. He was looking out the passenger window at a stretch of empty industrial waterfront, the kind of Brooklyn that existed between things, between neighborhoods, between what the city wanted to be and what it actually was. "If I'd told you," he said, "you would have made a different choice on that bridge. You would have been running your own play, and your play would have gotten you killed." He paused. "They know how you think. They built you. They would have anticipated every move you made except the one where you went over the barrier. You used me. I kept you alive. Don't do that." Her voice came out flat and hard. "Don't dress up manipulation as a favor. I spent 4 months inside your operation believing I was building a case against you. Do you understand what that means? I put people at risk. I made promises to a handler who was feeding everything I reported directly to the people trying to kill the women you were hiding." The silence after that was different, heavier. "Turn here," he said. She turned. The safe house was a garage, not metaphorically, an actual functioning auto repair garage in a neighborhood of auto repair garages and warehouses, and the kind of small businesses that existed on the economic margins of the city and asked no questions about who came and went at odd hours. The roll-down door opened from a remote that Lucian produced from somewhere in his jacket, and she pulled the Civic inside and killed the engine. The lights came on automatically. Overhead fluorescents, 2 of them flickering at the far end, casting the space in the particular cold light of function over comfort. There was a car on the lift, a black SUV, stripped of plates. Along the east wall, workbenches with the kind of organized disarray that meant someone actually worked here. A door in the back wall. Through that door was a room. The room was small and utilitarian. Cot, table, 2 chairs, a first aid kit on the wall that was not the grocery store variety. This was the real thing: suture supplies, hemostatic gauze, IV equipment sealed in packaging, medications in labeled bottles that told Kaylin someone with medical knowledge had stocked this place deliberately. Lucian sat in the chair nearest the first aid kit and started taking his jacket off. The process of removing it was slow and controlled in the way that people control pain. The jaw set, the breathing measured, the focus directed inward where the damage was. She took the jacket from him before he asked. The wound was bad. The bullet had entered the back of the shoulder and, as best she could tell from examination, she was not a medic, had field training and nothing more, had exited cleanly, which was the one piece of good news in an otherwise grim picture. He'd lost significant blood. The wetsuit beneath the jacket was evidence of that, dark from the shoulder halfway down the side. "I'm going to pack this," she said. It's going to hurt. I'm aware of how it works. I'm telling you so you don't move when I do it." He looked at her, something that might have been amusement in a different context. Noted. She worked. He made one sound, a single sharp exhale through the nose, when she applied the hemostatic gauze with the pressure it needed, and then nothing. She packed the wound, covered it, taped it with the controlled efficiency of someone who had done this in training and hoped never to do it in practice. Her hands were steady. She was slightly surprised by that. Some distant part of her had expected to fall apart somewhere in this process, had expected the accumulated weight of the past 48 hours to manifest as trembling hands or blurred vision or the specific physical dissolution of someone whose nervous system had simply had enough. Her hands were steady. She didn't know if that was strength or damage. She suspected it was damage. When she finished, she took the other chair and put the table between them. "Talk," she said. "What do you want to know?" "Everything you didn't put in the folder." Lucien leaned back in the chair with the careful movement of a man managing pain and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at her, and began. "Oh, the network had a name inside the circles that knew about it. They called it the Corridor. It had operated for 15 years beneath federal oversight structures, using the machinery of national security as cover, the kinds of operations that generated classification levels, that made oversight inconvenient, the kinds of designations that let people move money and people and information across jurisdictions without triggering the alarms that would trigger if civilians tried the same things. Evelyn Graves had built it from the beginning. Lucien said her name with the particular flatness of someone who had been afraid of a thing long enough that the fear had calcified into something colder and more durable. Wolf was the mechanism. Graves was the architect. The women Lucien had been hiding were witnesses, not to crimes in the conventional sense, not to the kind of crimes that generated police reports and courtroom testimony. They were witnesses to the corridor itself, women who had been inside it, some willingly, some not, some who had crossed paths with it in ways they hadn't understood until too late, and who had accumulated enough specific knowledge that their continued existence represented a liability. "How long have you been running the underground?" Kaylin said. 3 years? Why? He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, quiet in the way of someone deciding how much of a true answer to give. "Because I knew what they were doing," he said, "and because I had the resources to complicate it." He paused, "and because one of the first women they tried to disappear was someone I knew." "Who? Does it matter?" "It matters to me." He looked at her steadily. "My sister," he said. Kaylin let that sit. "She got out," he said. "Most of them don't. I started pulling the ones I could find before Wolf's people could close on them. It took a long time to build the infrastructure. The nightclub was a front, legitimate enough that federal attention focused on the criminal operation rather than what was underneath it. You let them build a case against you. I needed them close. I needed to know what they knew and when they knew it." Something moved across his face. "I didn't anticipate they'd send someone like you." "What does that mean?" "It means you were good. You're very good. No flattery in it. Purely analytical. And it means Wolf was smarter than I'd accounted for. Using someone who genuinely believed the case was real, someone whose conviction would read as authentic because it was authentic, that was a refinement. Earlier attempts to build cases against me were obviously constructed. Yours had weight to it. Real investigative weight." Kaylin felt sick. Not metaphorically, a physical nausea that rose and settled. 12 names, she said. "What?" 12 names in my reports that I identified as Veil organization contacts. 12 people I provided to my handler in good faith. She was looking at the table. "How many of them are still alive?" The silence told her. "How many?" she said again, and her voice didn't shake, which somehow made it worse. 8, he said. "The other 4 were moved before your reports reached operational level. We had a flag inside the communications chain. Not reliable, but enough to act on when it triggered. 8 people dead." Partially through her. She didn't say anything for a long time. Lucien didn't try to fill the silence with reassurances, which was the only thing in the past 2 hours she'd been grateful to him for. Finally, she said, "What's the plan?" "The evidence in the folder is a copy. The original is distributed across 7 locations, 3 in the city, 4 outside. The distribution was triggered 6 hours ago. When the order to move on the bridge operation came through, my people executed the distribution protocol. Where does the evidence go? Journalists. Real ones. Not the kind that can be pressured. And 2 federal prosecutors who are not part of the corridor and have enough institutional insulation that Graves can't move against them quickly. How do you know they're not part of it? I don't, he said. Not with certainty, but I've spent 3 years vetting the options, and those 2 are the least compromised ones I can access. He looked at her directly. This is how it works when you're operating without a clean system to operate inside of. You don't get certainty. You get probability and timing. Kaylin understood that. She didn't like it, but she understood it. The women in the basement, she said. Obsidian Saint. The raid. They're already out. That was the second trigger in the protocol. By the time Federal Tactical hit the building, there was nothing to find. She exhaled. Where are they now? Moving. Different locations, different cities, some of them. He shifted in the chair, pain crossing his face briefly, controlled and then gone. They're the primary evidence. Their testimony, their documentation. The folder is context. They are the case. Then they need to be protected. Yes. By who? Your people? She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't pull it back. How many of your people are already compromised? How many fed information to Wolf while you were building this? You've been running this operation for 3 years and they've been watching you the whole time. Every person in your organization is a potential breach. Lucian's jaw tightened. I'm aware. Then you understand why trusting your network right now is exactly the wrong move. I don't have another network. You have me. He looked at her. I know how federal protective operations work, she said. I know how Wolf's people think. I know which federal infrastructure is clean because I spent 4 months reading the files that crossed my handler's desk, and I read everything, not just the veil material. I built a map of the corridor without knowing that's what I was doing. She tapped the table. I have information you don't have, and right now that's the most valuable thing in this room. You're a wanted woman. I'm a wanted woman who knows where all the exits are. Something shifted in his expression. Not trust. It was too early for trust, and they both knew it. But a reassessment, a recalculation. The 6 of my people who ran the distribution protocol, he said. I need to verify they're intact, that they weren't followed. How do you plan to do that? I need to make contact. They'll be monitoring your communication channels, everything flagged under your organization's profile. I know. Then how? There's a system, he said. Physical. Drop points. It takes time, but it can't be intercepted remotely. He stood, slowly, the shoulder dictating the pace. There's a change of clothes in the back, and food. Eat something. We move in 2 hours. He walked toward the back of the room. Veil. He stopped. The folder mentioned a name, she said. Someone inside the bureau who's been feeding information to Graves for at least 4 years. Someone at a level where they would have access to personnel assignments. She paused. Someone who would have had input into selecting me for this assignment. He turned around. His face was completely still. You know who it is, she said. Yes. Tell me. He looked at her for a long moment. Something working behind those dark eyes. Calculation or something older than calculation. Something that had to do with what it cost to say a thing out loud that you'd been carrying in silence for a long time. Your handler, he said. Not Wolf. The one below Wolf. It's, Agent Renata Solis. Kaylin heard the name, and the room went briefly sideways. Renata Solis had been her operational handler for this assignment. Had been the person she'd called twice a week from the burner phone at the gym. Had been the person who'd processed every name in every report Kaylin had filed. Quiet, competent, always available, always careful. The person who had briefed her on Lucian Vale's alleged victims with a specificity and conviction that had felt like evidence. The person who had received 12 names from Kaylin and apparently passed at least 4 of them to people who could act on them before Lucian's flag could trigger. Kaylin said, How long have you known? 8 months. You didn't tell me. I didn't know you. His voice was flat, not cruel. I didn't know if you were clean, and I couldn't risk the women downstairs on the possibility that you were. She understood that, hated it and understood it. If Solis is burned, she said, Then everything I reported is compromised. Every name, every piece of operational detail I provided. They know our investigative methodology. They know my training, my background, my cover story protocols. Yes. Which means any move we make that follows standard federal procedure is anticipated, he said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment, the weight of it. We need to move differently, she said. That's been the plan from the beginning. Your plan. She looked at him. I need to understand the rest of it, all of it. Not the version you hand to people who need to stay motivated, the actual architecture, what you've built, what you haven't, what the exposure points are. Lucien studied her. The fluorescent light above them buzzed faintly, one of the tubes getting ready to go. In the silence, the sounds of the garage filtered through, the tick of metal cooling, the distant sound of traffic, rain still working on the roof. All right, he said. All right? You want the architecture? I'll give you the architecture. He moved to the table and sat down again, which told her the shoulder was worse than he'd let on. Sitting was easier than standing at that level of blood loss. But once I do, you can't unlearn it, any of it. And the moment I brief you fully, you become part of it, she said. Yes. She didn't hesitate. I was already part of it the moment I went over that barrier. He looked at her steadily for a moment longer. Then he began to talk. They worked through the night. By 4 a.m, the table between them was covered in papers. Lucien wrote when he needed to. And Kaylin had the shape of the full operation in her head for the first time. The women, the evidence chains, the 7 distribution points, and the logic behind each of them. The 2 prosecutors and their specific institutional positions. The journalists and what each of them needed to make the story viable for publication. The flag system inside the communications chain and the 3 people who operated it, the dead drops and the timing sequences. She asked questions that cut to the structural weaknesses each time, and each time Lucien answered without deflection. She noticed that. It told her things about how he operated, that he'd learned from people who'd burned him through overconfidence and had made a deliberate practice of not repeating that pattern. Around 4:30, she said, "The prosecutors, you said they're the least compromised option, not that they're clean." "Correct." "What's the contamination risk?" "One of them has a relationship with a judge who has corridor connections. The relationship is personal, not professional. I don't believe it's been weaponized, but it's a vector." "Which one?" He told her. She filed it. "The journalists," she said, "both need editorial approval before anything runs. That's a window Graves can use. 48 hours at most before the first story goes to print, based on the evidence package they received." He glanced at his watch. "Which means we have approximately—" A sound from outside stopped them both. Not loud, not dramatic, a specific small sound. The kind of sound a person makes when they're trying very hard not to make sound and failing at the micro level. The toe of a shoe on concrete, outside the roll-down door. The sound of a deliberate footstep that had miscalculated the silence it was working in. Kaylin was out of the chair before the thought completed. She pulled the ankle piece, the small backup Glock that had survived the river, and moved to the right side of the door, pressing flat to the wall. Lucien had moved too, and he'd moved fast for a man with a packed bullet wound, which told her the adrenaline had burned through whatever pain management he'd been running. He had a weapon she hadn't seen him produce, a compact black pistol that had apparently lived somewhere in the lining of the ruined suit jacket. They looked at each other. One person, maybe 2. The sound pattern was too careful for a tactical team. A team wouldn't bother with this level of quiet, would come through the door with numbers and noise and the confidence of overwhelming force. This was someone alone, or nearly alone, trying not to announce themselves. Lucien held up 2 fingers. She nodded. He moved to the door. She braced. The roll-down door came up fast. Lucien hit the switch on the wall and stepped back in the same motion. And the person outside had no time to react before the light from inside the garage hit them full in the face. It was a woman, late 20s, short hair, dark jacket soaked through with rain, a cut on her chin that was fresh enough to still be seeping. She had her hands partially raised, not the trained compliance posture of law enforcement, but the instinctive gesture of someone trying to communicate non-threat while their body was still running on the chemicals of someone who'd been running. Kaylin recognized her. It took 3 seconds, and then it landed fully. Myron Cole, 26 years old, listed in Kaylin's case file as missing, presumed dead, last seen 11 months ago in connection with a financial services company with corridor-adjacent investment structures. One of the names Kaylin had never been able to fully account for in Lucy Yen's organization because she didn't fit the pattern of the other victims. She'd been in the folder. Her name was in the section about witnesses Graves's people had failed to locate. She was here, which meant she knew this location, which meant she was either part of Lucien's network, or she'd been followed to it. Kaylin looked past the woman into the dark street behind her. Rain and shadow and the distant orange of a traffic signal cycling through its colors for nobody. No visible movement, no parked vehicles that hadn't been there when they arrived. But visible wasn't the same as clear. She knew that. "Get inside," Kaylin said. Marin Cole came inside. The door came down behind her, and Marin looked at Lucien with an expression that told Kaylin there was history there. Not a warm history, a complicated one. And said, breathing hard, still coming down from whatever she'd been running from, "Solis made me. I don't know how long ago, but she made me. And she knows I know this location." She looked at Kaylin then. At Kaylin specifically, not at Lucien, which was interesting. "She also knows who you are," Marin said. "The real you. She's been running a parallel investigation into your actual identity for 3 weeks. She was waiting for the bridge operation to confirm it before she moved, but the bridge went wrong," Kaylin said. "The bridge went wrong," Marin said, "and now she's not waiting anymore." The fluorescent light above them buzzed. Kaylin looked at Lucien. Lucien looked at Kaylin, and outside, somewhere in the wet dark of a Brooklyn that didn't care about any of them, something moved. Kaylin moved first. She grabbed Marin by the jacket collar and pulled her away from the door, away from the wall with the window, into the interior of the back room where the angle from the street was worst. Marin didn't resist. She went where she was pulled with the boneless compliance of someone who had already used up their resistance getting here and had nothing left to argue with. Lucien killed the overhead light. The garage went dark except for the faint bleed of the city through the gap at the bottom of the roll-down door. Sodium orange, thin as a knife edge. Kaylin stood in that dark with her back to the wall and her weapon up and listened to the rain working on the roof and the street outside and the sound of Marin's breathing, which was ragged in a way that wasn't entirely from exertion. 30 seconds. Nothing moved outside. A minute. Still nothing. Lucien's voice came from across the dark, low and flat. "How far back did you run?" 6 blocks, Marin said. "Maybe 7. I cut through the salvage yard on Dykeman." "Did you see a tail, or are you guessing?" "I saw a car. Dark sedan, no plates, sitting outside my last location when I came out. It hadn't been there when I went in." Marin's voice had the careful precision of someone reporting under pressure, editing the fear out in real time. "It pulled out when I walked. I ran. I don't know if they followed me here or if they already had this location." "I told you before," Lucien said, and there was something in his voice that Kaylin hadn't heard from him yet. Not anger exactly, but the compressed version of it. The kind that had been sitting on something for a long time. "I told you not to move without a signal from me." "I know. You knew this location. You knew the protocol. And you came here anyway. Solis had people at the primary. I had nowhere else to go. You had the secondary. You had the drop on." "The secondary was burned too." Marin's voice cracked on the last word, and she stopped, and in the pause Kaylin could hear her working to get it back. "Solis burned both of them. I don't know when, I don't know how, but there were people at both locations and I was out of options and you were the only—" "How did she get both locations?" Lucien said. Silence. Kaylin felt it, the specific quality of a silence that wasn't empty. The silence of a question that the person being asked already knew the answer to and was deciding whether to tell it. "Marin," Lucien said. "I told someone," Marin said, very quietly. 3 weeks ago, I told someone I trusted and I shouldn't have." "Who?" It wasn't a question. It was the sound a door makes right before it closes permanently. "His name was Dario. He was—" She stopped, started again. "He said he was independent. He said he had no federal connection. He'd been helping me move information for 2 months. And he never gave any indication—" "Dario Fenn," Lucien said. "You know him." "I know who he is. I've known who he is for 4 months. His voice was completely level, which made it worse. Dario Fen has been a corridor asset since 2021. He specifically targets people in transitional protection situations, people who've just broken from their handlers and are looking for alternatives. He's very good at appearing independent. He's very good at appearing trustworthy. A pause. He's given them 6 names in the past 18 months. 2 of those people are dead. The room was very still. Marin made a sound. Small, compressed. The sound of someone absorbing a blow they'd seen coming but had hoped wouldn't land. Kaylin lowered her weapon slightly. Not all the way, but enough. How much did you tell him? The secondary location, Marin said. The drop protocol. And her voice was barely above a whisper now. The distribution list, the 7 points. Lucien went completely silent. Kaylin looked toward where she could hear him standing in the dark and felt the shift in the room's temperature. Metaphorical and somehow almost physical, the specific cold that descended when something that had been built carefully over a long time was suddenly threatened at its foundation. The 7 distribution points, she said carefully. The journalists and the prosecutors. I didn't give him names. I gave him the structure, the number of points, the general categories about media and federal. I didn't think, it's enough, Lucien said. 3 words, quiet as a verdict. It's enough to anticipate the play, Kaylin said, working it through as she said it. They don't need the specific names. They know the evidence is going to media and to federal prosecutors. That narrows the field significantly. There are only so many journalists in this city with the profile and the institutional backing to run a story this size, and only so many prosecutors with enough insulation to be viable targets. They'll move on all of them, Lucien said, preemptively, before the first story runs. If they can compromise the evidence pipeline at enough points, the story dies, Kaylin said, or it runs without enough corroboration to survive a federal response, which amounts to the same thing. He moved. She heard him crossing the room. Careful, measured steps despite the dark. The movement of a man who knew the dimensions of every space he'd built. How long ago did you tell Fen the structure? 16 days, Marin said. Then they've had 16 days to develop countermeasures, Lucien said. We're not ahead of this anymore. Kaylin holstered the ankle piece. You said the distribution was triggered 6 hours ago. Who confirmed receipt? 2 of the 7 confirmed. Which 2? He told her. She filed them, cross-referenced them against what she knew about the federal landscape from 4 months of reading files that had been designed to brief her on the Vale investigation, but had inadvertently briefed her on a great deal more. One of the 2 felt solid. The other one, the prosecutor, she said. Marcus Reeves. Yes. His clerk, she said. His primary clerk. The woman who controls access to his docket. I saw her name in a financial disclosure cross-reference 3 months ago. I didn't think it was relevant at the time. It was attached to a shell company 2 degrees removed from a corridor-adjacent investment firm. The silence that followed had a different quality. Not the silence of bad news arriving, but the silence of pieces assembling themselves into a shape that was worse than any individual piece suggested. You're saying his office is compromised, Lucien said. I'm saying his clerk may be, which means anything routed through his official channels. He confirmed receipt through his official email, Lucien said. Kaylin closed her eyes briefly in the dark. Then they know what he received, she said, and they've had time to review it, which means they know the shape of the evidence package, what it proves, what it doesn't, where the gaps are. She paused. Graves is going to use those gaps. She's going to move before the story runs, and she's going to position this as a fabricated attack on federal infrastructure by a criminal organization, with a rogue former agent as the delivery mechanism. That's already the public narrative. No, right now it's a criminal narrative. She hasn't made it a national security narrative yet. That's the next move. Kaylin opened her eyes. Once she designates this as a national security threat, she gets tools she doesn't currently have. She can move against journalists under classification orders. She can freeze Reeves's office. She can make us disappear, Lucien said, in ways that don't require a body. The rain on the roof was the only sound. They left the garage at 5:43 in the morning, 3 of them now, which complicated everything. Marin moved slower, was more visible, required decisions that hadn't been built into the original framework. Kaylin watched Lucian manage this without complaint and without the particular resentment that would have been justified, and filed that observation alongside the others she'd been accumulating since the river. He'd given Marin a clean jacket from a bag in the back room, had looked at the cut on her chin and left it alone after determining it wasn't deep enough to need attention. He'd handed Kaylin a phone, burner loaded with a single contact labeled with a number rather than a name, and a set of car keys that went to the stripped SUV on the lift. "The lift lowers from the outside panel," he said. "On the west side of the building. You'll need to is." "I know how a hydraulic lift works," she said. "Good." He handed her the phone. "The number in that contact is a woman named Yael. She runs logistics for the Western distribution points. She knows what's in the evidence package, and she knows the chain of custody. If anything happens to me in the next 12 hours, she's the continuity point." Kaylin looked at the phone, then at him. "You're expecting something to happen to you. I'm expecting something to happen to all of us. I'm planning for the parts I can control." He pulled on a fresh jacket, black, like everything else, with the careful movement of someone whose left shoulder was packed with hemostatic gauze and held together by medical tape and will. "There's a man named Carver who operates out of a print shop in Sunset Park. He's been holding a second copy of the financial documentation, the original set, predating the folder I gave you. Wolf's people don't know he exists. Graves's people don't know he exists. He's outside the corridor's knowledge entirely because I've never put him in writing, and I've never communicated with him through any channel they could intercept." "How do you communicate with him?" "In person. Every 3 weeks. He expects me tomorrow morning." "You can't go in person. Your face is on every surveillance feed in the city by now, which is why you're going to go instead." Kaylin looked at him. "He'll need verification, Lucy," Ian said. "A phrase. I'll give it to you." He held her gaze. "He's the only copy of the financial documentation that Graves hasn't had 16 days to prepare a countermeasure for. If the other distribution points are compromised or suppressed, Carver is what's left." "You're giving me your last card," she said. "I'm giving you the card that needs to be played in a direction they won't anticipate. You're federal trained. You know how their surveillance systems work, what the blind spots are, how to move through the city in a way that doesn't trigger the pattern recognition protocols." He paused. "I can't do that right now. Marin can't do that. You can." She understood what he wasn't saying. He was also testing her, sending her out alone with his most protected asset's location and a verification phrase, sending her in a direction where the rational move, if she were running a play against him, would be to go to federal custody and trade the information for leniency. She could do that. It was an option. She thought about 12 names, about 8 people, about what remained of the version of herself that had sat at the desk by the window, saying those names in the dark. "Give me the phrase," she said. But Sunset Park at 6 in the morning was a neighborhood getting ready to work. Delivery trucks on 4th Avenue, the roll-up gates of small businesses opening in sequence, the smell of coffee and exhaust, and the particular wet concrete smell of a city that had been rained on all night. Kaylin moved through it in the stolen SUV and then on foot after she'd parked 6 blocks out, wearing the jacket Lucien had found for her. Dark gray, nondescript, the kind of thing 10,000 people in this neighborhood wore, with her hair down and her posture adjusted to the walk of someone with somewhere specific and boring to be. She'd done this before. She was good at this. The print shop was on a side street between a nail salon and a hardware store, with a hand-painted sign in the window that said, "Carver Copies, open 6 a.m. The lights inside were on. Through the glass she could see the blue-white glow of a large format printer cycling through its warm-up sequence, and behind the counter a man who matched the description Lucien had given her. 60s, compact, with the careful stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago not to move more than necessary. She went in. The bell above the door was the old mechanical kind, the hammer and dome type, and it rang with a small clean sound that felt inappropriate for the morning she was having. The man behind the counter looked up. His eyes did the same thing Lucien's did, that fast, complete inventory, and then settled into a neutral watchfulness. "Help you?" he said. "I need a print job," she said. "Large format. My associate sent me. He said you'd know the specs." She said the phrase Lucien had given her, 7 words, specific and meaningless out of context, and watched Carver's face. Nothing changed on the surface. Underneath, something did. A very subtle shift in the quality of his attention. He usually comes himself, Carver said. He's unavailable. How unavailable? Significantly. Carver studied her for a moment that stretched. Then he turned and walked to the back of the shop without saying anything else. And she followed because that was apparently the invitation. The back of the shop was where the real work happened. Not print work, but the infrastructure of someone who had been carefully maintaining a long-term secret. A fireproof safe built into the wall behind a shelving unit that swung out on a piano hinge. Inside the safe, a hard drive, a sealed envelope, and a flash drive in a Ziploc bag with a handwritten date on it going back 14 months. Carver didn't hand it to her. He stood in front of the open safe and looked at her and said, "Tell me something only someone who sat with him would know." She thought about the conversation in the back room at the garage, the specific texture of it, not the information, the quality, things that wouldn't be in a briefing. "He writes when he needs to think," she said, "on paper. He doesn't trust himself to remember accurately without it, and his handwriting is terrible." She paused. "He told me about his sister." Carver looked at her for another long moment. Then he took the hard drive out of the safe and held it out. She reached for it. The door to the print shop opened. The mechanical bell rang its small, clean sound. Kaylin didn't turn around immediately. She turned in the way you turned when you weren't expecting a threat, which was the only move available because turning fast would tell whoever had come in that she was expecting one. She turned and she looked, and she kept her face neutral and her hand away from the ankle piece. Two people. A man and a woman. Plain clothes. Too plain. The kind of plain that was a deliberate choice rather than a default. The woman was younger, maybe 30, with the physical economy of someone who trained. The man was older, broader, with a lateral scar at the corner of his jaw that told a story about a time something sharp had come very close to something important. Neither of them was looking at Carver. Both of them were looking at Kaylin. The woman said, "Agent Voss," not rogue agent, not suspect. Agent, present tense, which was specific. "I think you have the wrong person," Kaylin said. "My name is Tara Fisk," the woman said. "I'm with the Inspector General's office. We've been running an internal investigation into Deputy Director Wolf and Assistant Director Graves for 11 months. She reached into her jacket, slowly, deliberately, showing the motion before she completed it, and produced a credential wallet. "We're not here to detain you. We're here because we need what's in that safe, and we need your cooperation." Kaylin looked at the credential. IG office, federal issue, Fisk's photograph. It looked real. It felt real, which meant absolutely nothing, because she had spent 4 months inside an operation that had felt completely real and had been completely false. 11 months, she said. "Yes." "Then you know about the corridor." Fisk's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to confirm. "We know about the corridor." "You know about Evelyn Graves." "We know about Evelyn Graves." "Then you know why I'm not going to hand over a hard drive to two people I've never met who walked into a print shop at 6 in the morning without a warrant." "We don't have a warrant because a warrant requires going through channels that are compromised," Fisk said. "We've been operating off-book for the past 4 months, specifically because the standard channels—" "Everyone operating in this situation says they've been going off-book for good reasons," Kaylin said. "Everyone has a credential and a reason and an explanation for why the normal rules don't apply to them right now." She kept her body between Fisk and Carver. "Give me something I can verify. Something that isn't a credential and isn't a speech about why I should trust you." Fisk looked at the man with the scar. Something passed between them. Not uncertainty, something more like a decision being confirmed. "Marcus Reeves," Fisk said. "The prosecutor." "You were right about his clerk. Her name is Sandra Obi. She's been a corridor asset for 3 years, and Graves used her to access the evidence package that was routed to Reeves's office last night." Fisk paused. "We know because we've had a tap on Obi for 6 weeks. We heard the conversation. We know exactly what Graves received and what she's planning to do with it." Kaylin was very still. "What is she planning to do with it?" she said. "She's planning to use the national security designation by 9 this morning," Fisk said. "She already has the paperwork staged. Once it goes through, she can move against the journalists, freeze Reeves's office, and, this is the part that concerns us most, she can access the Federal Witness Protection Database to locate and move against the women currently in transit under Vail's protection network." Kaylin felt the floor drop slightly beneath her. The women in transit. You know about them. We've known about Vale's protection operation for 7 months. We've been leaving it alone because it was doing something our office couldn't do, keeping witnesses alive. Fisk's voice was flat and precise, delivering information without performance. But once Graves gets the national security designation, her clearance level allows her to access databases our office cannot protect. She will find those women. And unlike the previous attempts, she won't be sending individual contractors. She'll be sending a coordinated federal operation. The print shop was very quiet. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past on the street. Normal city noise, indifferent to everything happening in this room. Kaylin looked at Carver. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had agreed to hold a secret for a long time and was now watching the consequences of that decision arrive in a form he hadn't anticipated. 9 o'clock, she said. How long do we have? From now, 2 hours and 40 minutes, Fisk said. And what exactly do you need from me? The financial documentation in that safe is the piece we're missing. Our case against Graves is built on operational evidence, communications intercepts, movement logs, financial transfers. But we don't have the original source documentation that proves the corridor's existence predates Graves's tenure as assistant director. Without that, her defense team will argue she inherited a corrupt system and was working to dismantle it. With it, she's the architect, Kaylin said. And there's no mitigation. Correct. Kaylin looked at the hard drive in her hand. She looked at the woman in front of her, whose credentials were real and whose information was accurate, and whose explanation was entirely consistent with everything Lucian had told her about the shape of the operation. She looked at the man with the scar, who had not moved, had not spoken, had simply stood in the way that trained people stood when they were letting their partner run the approach. She thought about Renata Solis, about how completely she had trusted Renata Solis for 4 months. She thought about Wolf. She thought about the specific and irreversible damage done by trust given to people who had built themselves to receive it. Then she thought about 9 o'clock and 23 names and women in transit who would have no idea that a federal database query was about to locate them. I need to make a call, she said. We don't have 2 minutes, she said. Give me 2 minutes and I'll give you everything in this safe. Fisk looked at the man with the scar again. He gave a small nod. 2 minutes, Fisk said. Kaylin moved to the far corner of the shop, as far from the 2 federal agents as the space allowed, and dialed the number Lucian had given her. It rang twice. A woman's voice, sharp, accented, fully awake despite the hour. Yes. Yael, Kaylin said. My name is Kaylin Voss. Lucian gave me this number. I need you to listen very carefully, and I need you to do exactly what I tell you in the next 20 minutes, because if you don't, every woman in transit right now is going to be found by federal database query before 8:30. A pause. Brief. Talk, Yael said. Kaylin talked. She handed over the hard drive at 6:41. Fisk took it with the careful hands of someone handling something they'd been looking for a long time. The man with the scar produced a secure reader from somewhere in his jacket and began verification on the spot, checking the drive's hash against a reference value that Kaylin understood meant they'd known what this drive contained before they'd walked in the door. That told her something. She filed it. How did you know about this location? She said. Fisk looked up from watching the verification process. Vale's network has a participant we've been in contact with for 3 months, a woman named Celestine. Kaylin remembered Celestine, coffee without being asked, a flat voice describing a basement where women waited for something to be built. From the people inside your building. She came to us, Fisk said, not the other way. She'd spent 8 months watching Vale's operation and decided the IG investigation was the better path. A pause. She's the reason we knew the distribution was triggered last night. She's the reason we were positioned to intercept Obi's communication with Graves. Does Vale know? Kaylin said. Fisk's expression answered before her words did. No. There it was. Kaylin stood in the middle of the print shop and felt the shape of it settle into place with the particular horrible clarity of a thing you couldn't unknown once you'd seen it. Celestine had been feeding information to the IG investigation for 3 months, which meant 3 months of Vale's operational details, locations, personnel, protocols, had been going to Fisk's office, an office that was, by Fisk's own account, running off book and outside compromised channels. Outside compromised channels, or outside all channels, including the ones that would have provided oversight. Your investigation, Kalin said. 11 months, off book. Who authorized it? I'm not able to. Who authorized the IG investigation? Kalin said, and her voice came out different now. The voice she used in interrogation rooms, the voice that didn't ask, that stated the question as a demand and waited. Fisk was quiet. An investigation that runs for 11 months off book without internal authorization, Kalin said, is not an investigation. It's an operation. She looked at the credential wallet still on the counter where Fisk had laid it. IG credentials can be fabricated. I've seen it done. I've seen case files documenting it done by corridor assets, creating false oversight infrastructure to intercept exactly the kind of material that's on that drive. The man with the scar stopped looking at the verification reader. You should think carefully about what you're suggesting, Fisk said, and her voice had changed, not threatening, but different. The warmth, the precision of a briefing, gone. I'm not suggesting anything, Kalin said. I'm telling you that I've handed you a hard drive based on information you provided that I have no independent way to verify. And in approximately, she checked the time, 2 hours and 20 minutes. Either the national security designation goes through and Graves wins, or it doesn't, and whoever has that drive controls the most significant single piece of evidence in the case. She looked at Fisk directly. Which version of those two outcomes benefits the IG office, and which version benefits Graves? The silence in the print shop was absolute. Fisk looked at her with an expression Kalin couldn't fully read, and that inability, that specific failure of her best professional skill, landed in her chest like a stone. Then Fisk said quietly, "You're smarter than the file said," and reached for her weapon. Kalin was already moving, not toward the door, toward Carver, because Carver was behind the counter, and behind the counter was lower ground, and the counter itself was thick wood that would slow around. She grabbed his arm and pulled him down, and the first shot went over both of them and hit the large format printer with a sound like a bell being struck by something heavy. The man with the scar was circling left. Kalin had the ankle piece out, had it up, fired twice in his direction, not to hit, to move him, to buy 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, she grabbed the sealed envelope from the safe that was still open, the envelope she hadn't handed over because Fisk had only asked for the drive, and stuffed it inside her jacket. The second shot from Fisk took out the light above the counter. The shop went dark except for the glow of the printer's display panel, still cycling through its warm-up sequence in blue-white light, indifferent to the violence happening around it. Carver was on the floor beside her. She could hear him breathing. Fast, shallow, alive. She put her hand on his shoulder and he flinched. "Stay down," she said. She moved. The back door of the print shop opened onto an alley. She knew this because she'd noted it when she came in. Old habit, the kind Lucian had commented on, the kind that had apparently been the right instinct all along. She went through it at speed, shoulder first, into the cold morning air of the alley, and ran. Behind her she could hear Fisk shouting, not into the shop, into a radio, calling in a position, calling in backup that if it arrived, would not be IG backup, would be something else entirely, which meant Fisk was not IG, which meant the hard drive was gone, which meant the last protected piece of Lucien's evidence architecture, the piece Graves didn't have 16 days to prepare against, the piece that proved the corridor's origins, the piece that made mitigation impossible, was in the hands of people who worked for Evelyn Graves. Kalin ran through the alley and emerged onto a side street and kept running, her breath coming in hard white clouds in the morning cold, and felt the full weight of what had just happened settle onto her chest like something structural collapsing. She'd been played. Again. Different hands, same move. Build the case, establish the trust, present the time pressure, take the asset. She ran and she thought and she burned through the shock of it fast because shock was a luxury. And she was 2 hours and 15 minutes from a national security designation that would expose every woman in Lucian's network, and the only card left was the sealed envelope inside her jacket. Whatever was in it, whatever Carver had held separate from the drive, Whatever Lucien had put in a physical envelope rather than on a hard drive because some things you didn't trust to storage. She turned a corner and pressed herself into a doorway and caught her breath and pulled out the burner phone. She called Lucien's number. It rang and rang and rang and did not connect. She stood in the doorway with rain starting again overhead and the city waking up around her and the phone ringing into nothing, and understood that something had happened to Lucien Vale in the time she'd been in the print shop, and that she was now alone in a city that was actively hunting her, with an envelope she hadn't opened, a phone that wasn't connecting, and a deadline that was... She opened the envelope in the doorway with rain coming down on her hands. Her fingers were cold enough that she tore the corner wrong, had to slow down, had to make herself work carefully when every nerve in her body was screaming about the phone that wasn't connecting and the clock that was running and the city that was waking up around her with her face in every database it contained. She got the envelope open. Inside, 2 items. A folded sheet of paper with a handwritten address and 4 words beneath it. She controls the feed, in handwriting that was exactly as bad as she'd described to Carver. And a photograph. Small, printed on plain paper, slightly blurred at the edges the way photographs were when they'd been captured from surveillance footage and printed in a hurry. 2 people in conversation outside what appeared to be a federal building. The timestamp in the corner read 14 months ago. One of the people was Adrian Wolfe. The other was Evelyn Graves. That much was expected. But the third figure, partially visible at the edge of the frame, caught mid-turn as if about to walk away, face only 3/4 visible but enough. The third figure stopped Kaylin's breathing for a full 3 seconds. She knew that face. She knew it the way you knew the face of someone who had sat across from you twice a week for 4 months, who had taken your reports with careful hands and careful eyes, who had said good work in a voice that sounded like it meant something. Renata Solis wasn't below Wolfe, wasn't a mechanism in Graves's system. She was standing between them. Equal footing. The body language of a peer, not a subordinate, which meant the handler wasn't a compromised link in the chain. The handler was the chain. Kaylin folded the photograph into her jacket and looked at the address on the paper. A building in Tribeca. Specific floor, specific unit. And the 4 words, she controls the feed, the surveillance feed, the narrative feed, the media architecture that had spent the past 12 hours building the story of a rogue federal agent and the criminal who'd corrupted her. Solis was running it. Kaylin stepped out of the doorway and started walking toward the subway, fast but not running. Running flagged cameras differently than walking, one of the things you learned when you spent time studying how surveillance systems made their decisions. She kept her head slightly down, her hands in her pockets, her shoulders at the angle of someone moving through the morning with boring purpose. She dialed Lucien's number again while she walked. This time it connected on the first ring. Not Lucien's voice. Marin's. They took the garage, Marin said, and her voice was compressed and wrong in the specific way of someone speaking in a small space under high pressure. They came in 20 minutes after you left. 3 vehicles. He told me to run and I got out through the roof access, but he didn't... A sound. Not quite a sob. Marin didn't seem like a person who sobbed, seemed like a person who'd burned through that particular response a long time ago. They have him. Where did they take him? I couldn't follow. I was on the roof. I saw them load him into the center vehicle and they went north on... She stopped. He's alive. I saw him move when they put him in. He was fighting them. Kaylin processed this in the time it took to descend the first set of subway stairs. Lucien in federal custody. Except not official federal custody. Official federal custody had procedures, had paperwork, had the kind of institutional inertia that created time. This was Graves's custody, which was a different thing entirely. Marin, I need you to do something and I need you to do it in the next 90 minutes. Tell me. Yael, did you reach her after I called? She reached me. She's been moving people since your call. Most of them are out of the primary risk window, but there are 3 she couldn't relocate in time. They're in a location in Greenpoint. They need another 2 hours minimum to move safely, and we don't have... The national security designation changes the database access, Kaylin said. Once it goes through, Graves can locate them through federal systems that Yael's protocols can't obscure, so we need to stop the designation from going through. How? Solis is running the media architecture that's providing the justification for it. If that architecture collapses, if the narrative collapses publicly before 9 o'clock, Graves loses the political cover she needs to push the designation through. The designation requires sign-off from the National Security Advisor. That person will not sign something that's actively falling apart in public. She emerged from the stairs at a different street than she'd entered, continued walking. I need you to get to a journalist, not one of the 7 from the distribution list. They're all being watched. Someone outside that list. Someone with a platform big enough to move the story and small enough that Graves's people haven't flagged them yet. I don't think. Who have you talked to in the past year about any part of this? Anyone, even indirectly. A pause. Marin thinking. Kaylin could almost hear it. There's a woman, Marin said slowly. She's not a journalist, she's an investigative documentarian. She's been working on a trafficking piece independently for 2 years. She approached me 8 months ago through a mutual contact. I didn't give her anything operational, but we talked. She knows the general shape. Name. Petra Nance. She has a following. Not mainstream, but significant. And she has... Another pause. She has a streaming platform deal. She can publish directly. She doesn't need editorial approval. She doesn't need a print cycle. Get to her, Kaylin said. Right now. Tell her everything she can legally run with. The existence of the corridor, Wolf's name, Graves's name, the designation that's going through at 9. Tell her I'll call her directly in 40 minutes with verification. She paused. And Marin. Yeah. The 3 women in Greenpoint, are they mobile? Physically? Yes. It's not a physical limitation, it's a documentation issue. They don't have clean identities to move through transit checkpoints. Tell Yael to move them anyway. Checkpoints are manageable if you know which ones are staffed by federal contractors versus municipal transit authority. I'll send her the list. She knew that list, had memorized it 4 months ago as part of the briefing package that had been designed to help her surveil Lucien Vale's organization. It was, like everything else she'd been given, a tool that could be turned. Okay, Marin said. Okay. A breath. What are you doing? Getting Lucien back, Kaylin said. She hung up and descended into the subway. Boss. The address on the paper was a building in Tribeca that presented itself to the world as a media consulting firm. 12 floors, glass and steel, the kind of anonymous corporate exterior that meant everything or nothing depending on what you were looking for. Kaylin stood on the opposite side of the street for 4 minutes and watched the entrance and counted the variables. 2 visible security positions, one at the main door, one at the corner of the building's parking structure, both wearing the specific kind of plain clothes that wasn't plain at all to someone who'd spent time learning what different flavors of armed professional looked like. Not contract security. These were people with federal backgrounds using civilian cover, which told her the building was an active operational site, not a dormant one. Cameras on the entrance, cameras on the structure, probably cameras she couldn't see. She controls the feed. Solis controlled the surveillance architecture that was hunting Kaylin, which meant the cameras feeding into whatever system Solis was running from inside this building were showing Solis exactly what she wanted them to show, which meant walking through the front door was a declaration of location to the person Kaylin most needed to reach before that person could respond. She couldn't go through the front. She stood on the street and thought about the building's structure, thought about it the way she'd been trained to think about environments as problems with solvable geometries rather than fixed barriers. And then she walked around the block and found the service entrance on the building's south side. The service entrance was simpler, a loading dock, a single camera positioned to cover the dock itself rather than the approach. A delivery schedule that meant a truck was currently backed into the dock, unloading what appeared to be catering supplies for something happening on one of the upper floors. She walked in behind a man carrying 2 large catering trays, matching his pace, positioning herself in the visual shadow of the delivery, and was inside the building before the camera's field of view could have established her as distinct from the delivery personnel. The service corridor was white cinder block and fluorescent light and the smell of industrial cleaning solution. She moved through it toward the freight elevator, found the elevator, and stood for a moment with her hand on the call button. The paper said a specific floor. 7th. The elevator would log the floor selection. That was a known variable. Service elevators in buildings running active surveillance operations almost always had floor logging, which meant the moment she selected 7, a signal would go to whatever monitoring system was running in this building. She'd have approximately 90 seconds from that moment before a response reached her position. She pressed 7. The elevator moved. She counted. The doors opened on 7 and she came out of the elevator already moving, already reading the corridor. Doors on both sides, one door at the far end with a different quality of light beneath it, the blue-white glow of screens. She went toward it. 30 seconds gone. The door was not locked. She found that interesting for exactly the time it took to push it open and understand why. Because Renata Solis was already looking at the door when Kaylin came through it. The room was a command center in miniature. 6 screens on the far wall, 4 workstations, 2 additional people who stood up from their chairs the moment the door opened and had their hands moving toward weapons before they'd registered who had come through. Solis was standing at the central workstation with her hands flat on the desk, and she was looking at Kaylin with an expression that was not surprise. Was not surprise at all. "Stand down," Solis said to the 2 other people, and they stopped. Didn't relax. They stood with their hands visible and their attention split between Kaylin and their supervisor in the way of people waiting for the order to change. Kaylin had the ankle piece up. She'd drawn it coming through the door, had it on Solis, which meant she had 1 target and 2 people in the room she wasn't covering. That was the mathematics of the situation, and it was not in her favor. But Solis had said, "Stand down," and Kaylin understood from the quality of that command, the absolute expectation of compliance, that whatever was happening here was not a confrontation Solis was running from threat. It was a confrontation Solis had been expecting. "You knew I had the address," Kaylin said. "I knew Lucian gave it to someone before we picked him up. I suspected it was you." Solis hadn't moved her hands from the desk. She was in her late 40s, sharp-boned, with the particular composure of someone who had been in difficult rooms for a long time and had learned to treat difficulty as weather rather than crisis. "You left the envelope when you left the drive. That was a mistake. Or it was intentional." Solis tilted her head slightly. "Was it?" Kaylin looked at the screens. 4 of them were running surveillance feeds. She could see the garage in Red Hook, could see the print shop, could see 2 other locations she recognized as connected to Lucian's network. One screen was running what appeared to be a media dashboard, headlines, social feeds, broadcast monitors cycling through morning news. One screen was dark, the one that was dark. "Where is he?" Kaylin said. "Secure," Solis said. "That's not an answer. It's the answer you're getting right now." Solis's voice was completely level. "Put the weapon down, Kaylin." "Not yet. You came here alone. You came in through the service entrance, which tells me you know the front entrance is covered, and you have 1 weapon with, 6 rounds left if you haven't fired since the river, against 3 people in a room where the exits are behind you." She paused. "You're not here to shoot anyone, so put it down." Kaylin kept the weapon up. "Show me he's alive." Solis reached across the desk and touched a key on the central workstation. The dark screen came on. A room, concrete walls. Lucian sitting in a chair with his hands behind him, his head down, the packed shoulder wound visible through the torn jacket. Alive. She could see the rise and fall of his breathing, slow and controlled, conscious or close to it. The camera was static, positioned high in the corner of the room, wide angle. No timestamp, no location indicator. "Where?" Kaylin said. "Here," Solis said. "Sub-level 2. He's being held in the building." Kaylin processed that. "Why?" "Because I needed you here." Solis straightened up slowly, deliberately, and because he needed to be somewhere Graves's tactical teams couldn't reach him. If I'd left him in that garage, they'd have found him within the hour. I moved him. The room was very quiet. "You moved him," Kaylin said. "My people picked him up before Graves's contractors arrived. He fought, hence the situation on screen. But he's not been further injured." Solis's voice was careful, precise. "I am not working for Graves, Kaylin. I know that's not worth anything to you right now, given what the photograph shows. I know how it looks. I'm asking you to give me 4 minutes to explain what you're actually looking at." 40 seconds since the elevator. No response team had come through the door. Kaylin lowered the weapon. Not holstered, lowered. 4 minutes, Solis began. The photograph was 14 months old. The meeting it documented had been a controlled approach. Solis presenting herself to Graves as a potential asset, feeding her a carefully constructed false intelligence package about the IG investigation status, making Graves believe the investigation was stalled, misdirected, nowhere near the corridor's actual exposure points. Wolf had been present as the introducer. The meeting had lasted 11 minutes. Solis had worn a wire. The recording of that meeting was the fifth piece of the evidence chain. Not in Lucian's distribution, not in Carver's safe. It existed in exactly one place, the IG's internal evidence server, which was not one of the compromised channels because it was air-gapped, physically isolated, accessible only from within the office building Kaylin was currently standing in. "You've been running the actual IG investigation," Kaylin said. "For 11 months, Solis said. Wolf recruited me 8 years ago the same way he recruited you. I believed him for 4 of those years. When I started seeing the shape of the corridor, I went to the IG's office and I made a choice." She looked at Kaylin steadily. Staying in place was the only option that gave us access to the operation's internal communications. Feeding reports to Wolf, feeding reports to Graves, maintaining my position, it was the only way to stay inside the information architecture long enough to build an unassailable case. And assigning me to the Vale investigation. Solis was quiet for a moment. "That was Wolf's decision. He chose you because he trusted your conviction. I couldn't stop the assignment without exposing my position." She held Kaylin's gaze. "But I was able to moderate what I passed upward from your reports. The 4 names I forwarded, I couldn't hold them all. Graves was monitoring my output. If I'd suppressed everything, she would have flagged it." 8 people, Kaylin said. "I know. 8 people are dead because of what moved through your operation. 4 of them were already targeted before your reports confirmed anything. The other 4... Solis stopped. The composure cracked slightly, the way very controlled things cracked. A small fissure, barely visible, running through the surface. "The other 4 I carry. I will carry them. That's not something I can give you an answer for." The clock on the media dashboard read 7:42, 78 minutes to the designation. "Fisk," Kaylin said. "The woman in the print shop. Corridor asset. She's been running interdiction on physical evidence chains for 2 years, presenting herself as IG or FBI Internal Affairs, collecting material before it reaches safe hands." Solis pulled up something on the central screen. "She's been tracked, but we couldn't move on her without triggering Graves's awareness that we were close. Now she has the drive. Can you intercept it? We've been trying to locate her for the past 40 minutes. She's off-grid." Kaylin thought about the drive, about what was on it, about the envelope in her jacket. "The drive alone isn't sufficient," she said. "Lucien told me. The drive is financial documentation. It proves the corridor's financial structure, but it doesn't prove Graves's direct operational control. It can be argued as circumstantial." "Correct. The wire recording from the meeting in the photograph. Does it include direct statements of operational control?" Solis looked at her carefully. "Yes. And the IG evidence server said, it's here, in this building." "Yes." "Then we don't need the drive," Kaylin said. "We never needed the drive. The drive was Lucian's best option because he didn't know about the recording. But the recording is better. The recording is, if it's what you're describing, it's the case." "It's the case," Solis confirmed. 11 minutes of Graves explicitly describing her operational control of the corridor, her relationship with Wolf, the witness elimination program, in her own voice. "Then why?" Kaylin said, and her voice came out harder than she intended. "Are we standing here at 7:42 with 18 minutes before—" "Because the recording needs to reach the National Security Advisor's office before the designation paperwork does," Solis said. "And because the 2 channels I had to do that are compromised. The prosecutors are frozen. The journalists are being suppressed." She pulled up another screen. The media dashboard, the morning news cycle running in silence. "Graves moved faster than we anticipated. She used your bridge event as the accelerant. The footage of a federal agent going over the barrier with a known criminal has been running for 12 hours. Public opinion is primed. The NSA's office is predisposed to sign." She looked at Kaylin. "I need a channel that Graves doesn't know about. Something outside the infrastructure she's been monitoring." Outside the infrastructure. Kaylin thought about a voice she'd spoken to 50 minutes ago. A woman with a streaming platform deal and 2 years of independent work on a trafficking piece in a direct publishing channel that didn't need print cycles or editorial approval. She thought about what Marin had been doing while Kaylin was in this building. She pulled out the burner phone. "I need Lucian out of sublevel 2, she said. "Right now. And I need him in this room in 5 minutes. He's in no condition. He's been in worse." She was already dialing. "Get him up here." Solis looked at her for a beat. Then she nodded at one of the 2 other people in the room. The phone rang once. "Tell me you reached her," Kaylin said when Marin picked up. "I reached her." Marin's voice was compressed, moving. She was somewhere loud, somewhere with street noise behind her. "She's set up and ready. She's been ready for 20 minutes. She needs the source. She needs someone on record." "She's going to get 2, Kaylin said. "Are you with her right now?" "I'm outside her building." "Go inside. Don't leave. I'll call you back in 10 minutes with the recording." She hung up and looked at Solis. "The recording," she said. "How do you transmit from an air-gapped server?" "You don't," Solis said. "You physically carry the output. That's the point of the air gap. Then we need a physical output in the next 8 minutes." Solis was already moving to a workstation. "The output is an audio file. I can have it on a drive-in." The door behind Kaylin opened. She spun, weapon up. Lucien walked in. He looked terrible. The packed shoulder was holding, but the blood loss and the hours showed in his face. A grayish quality beneath the brown of his skin, eyes slightly sunken, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who was managing their body rather than inhabiting it naturally. His hands were free. He looked at the weapon she had pointed at him, then at her face, and something in the tightness around his eyes loosened slightly. "You found the address," he said. "You left it for me. I didn't know if you'd use it." "I didn't know if I'd use it either." He looked at Solis. Something passed between them. Not warmth, but a long, complex acknowledgement. 2 people who had been operating in the same darkness from different positions and had apparently decided at some point neither of them had announced to coordinate without telling each other everything. "The recording," he said to Solis. "Almost ready." He looked back at Kaylin. "Fisk has the drive." "The drive doesn't matter." He processed that. She watched him process it, watched him reconfigure the architecture of the operation in real time, discarding the drive and building around the recording, and the speed with which he did it told her why he'd survived 3 years inside a system that had been actively trying to destroy him. "The documentarian," he said. "Marin's contact." "How did you—" "Marin called me before she called you." Something that might have been a version of dry humor. "I still have a phone, different number." He looked at the media dashboard, the clock, the headlines, the morning news cycle running its story about them on mute. "The NSA's chief of staff," he said to Solis. "Miriam Holt, she's clean. I verified her independently. If the recording reaches her before the designation paperwork—" "I know," Solis said. "But she's in Washington. The paperwork is here." "She has staff in the New York field office," Lucien said. "3rd floor of the Federal Building on Broadway. A woman named Deanna Park. If Park receives the recording and flags it to Holt's personal line—" "You know Deanna Park," Solis said. "I know people," Lucien said simply. Kaylin looked between them. The clock on the dashboard read 7:51, 69 minutes. "Give me the drive with the recording on it," she said. Both of them looked at her. "I can get to the Federal Building in 25 minutes, she said. "I know the building's layout. I know which entrance has the camera blind spot on the northeast corner because I used that entrance twice during the Vale investigation, and it wasn't in the surveillance log either time. And I know what Deanna Park looks like because her photograph was in the NSA liaison briefing package I received 4 months ago." "You're the most visible person in New York right now," Solis said. "I'm also the only one in this room who isn't carrying a bullet wound, who knows the building, and who has nothing left to lose by walking through a federal facility." She held out her hand. "The drive." Lucien looked at her hand, at her face. She could see him doing the calculation. The same calculation he'd done in the garage when he'd decided to trust her with Carver's location, but higher stakes now, the entire operation balancing on it. He looked at Solis. Solis pulled the drive from the workstation, walked across the room, and placed it in Kaylin's hand. It was small, lighter than it should have been for what it contained. Kaylin closed her fingers around it. If she gets the recording and flags Holt, she said to Lucian, how long does it take for the designation to be stopped? If Holt acts immediately, 30 minutes, maybe 20. And the women in Greenpoint, Yael's timeline. They'll be clear of the risk window in 90 minutes if they move now. So I need to buy them an hour, Kaylin said. I get the recording to park by 8:30. Holt stops the designation by 9. The women are clear by 9:30. She looked at the clock. It's tight. It's impossible, Solis said, not unkindly. It's the only play, Kaylin said. If we wait for a better option, the designation goes through and the option doesn't matter anymore. She was already moving toward the door. Kaylin! Lucian's voice stopped her with her hand on the door frame. She turned. He was looking at her from across the room with the full weight of everything the past 12 hours had been. The river, the garage, the evidence, the betrayals stacked on top of each other, the specific and irreversible cost of every decision they'd both made that had led to this room at 7:53 in the morning. The building has 4 tactical units on rotation since this morning, he said. They'll be watching the northeast entrance. I know. They have shoot-on-site authorization. I know. A pause. Then you understand what you're walking into. She looked at him steadily. I understood that on the bridge, she said. She went through the door, kept Broadway at 8 in the morning was exactly what it always was. The specific organized chaos of a city that had never learned to do anything quietly. Delivery trucks and pedestrians and the percussion of 1,000 small transactions happening simultaneously. The particular smell of exhaust and coffee and rain-wet concrete that was New York's signature, regardless of season or hour or what was happening above the street-level machinery of ordinary life. Kaylin moved through it with the drive in her jacket pocket and her hand near the ankle piece she hadn't used since the print shop, and her eyes running the geometry of every face she passed, every parked vehicle, every rooftop edge where a tactical position could be established without disrupting the street below. She counted federal assets the way she'd been trained, by what didn't fit. The man with the newspaper at the corner of Chambers who hadn't turned a page in 4 minutes. The car parked in a loading zone that was too clean for a neighborhood car. The woman in the coffee shop by the window whose eyes moved in a pattern that wasn't random. 3 positions. Probably more she couldn't see. The northeast entrance of the federal building was still 100 yards ahead. She stopped at a newsstand and bought a coffee she didn't need, buying 60 seconds of stationary observation time in a context that didn't register as suspicious. She drank it and looked at the building and thought about the geometry of the problem with the particular flat clarity that came when everything else had been stripped away and what was left was just the problem and the solution and the distance between them. The northeast camera blind spot was real. She'd used it twice. But that was before shoot on sight, before her face was on every federal system in the building, before the 4 tactical units on rotation. She couldn't go in clean. She'd known that when she left the building in Tribeca. She'd said she knew it and she'd meant it, and she was standing here with 61 minutes on the clock, confirming it with her body rather than just her head. She couldn't go in clean. But she didn't need to. She needed Deanna Park to come out. She pulled out the burner phone and called Marin. Are you with Nance? She said. Yes, we're set up and ready to... I need you to run something through Nance's platform right now, before the recording. Something that will reach Deanna Park's attention specifically. She described what she needed in 30 seconds flat, short, direct, the kind of message that would register as credible rather than noise to someone inside a federal building who was monitoring public information channels as part of their job function. You want us to broadcast your location, Marin said slowly. I want you to broadcast a message that Deanna Park will read as coming from a credible source with the recording, something that tells her the recording exists and where she can receive it. She paused. Without telling anyone else where I actually am. That's a brief silence. That's a very thin line. I know what it is. Can Nance do it? A murmured conversation on the other end. Then Marin. She says 30 seconds. Tell her to go. She hung up and moved. Not toward the northeast entrance. Toward the building's south plaza. Open, exposed. The kind of space that was designed to be inhospitable to loitering. with its broad concrete expanse and the small fountain that was off for the season and the 3 stone benches that faced the building's main glass facade. She sat on the center bench, put the coffee cup in her left hand, put her right hand in her jacket pocket around the drive, and waited to see if Deanna Park read morning intelligence updates before 8:15. The tactical asset at the corner of Chambers had seen her by now. She could feel the quality of attention change from 30 yards away. That specific prickling along the back of the neck that wasn't instinct but was the product of training, the integration of small signals below conscious identification. The newspaper man had moved. Not much. Enough. She kept her face on the building's glass facade. Come on, she thought. Come on, Park. Read your updates. Do your job. The building's south entrance opened. A woman came out. 40s, brisk, carrying a tablet and moving with the particular energy of someone who had just received information that required immediate action rather than deliberation. Kaylin recognized her from the NSA liaison briefing photograph. She stood up from the bench. The tactical asset at the corner was moving now. Not running, moving with the controlled purpose of a professional closing a distance while maintaining the appearance of normal foot traffic, which meant she had maybe 40 seconds before he was close enough to be a problem. Deanna Park had spotted her, had stopped 4 yards from the entrance and was looking at her with an expression that was processing multiple inputs simultaneously. The face from the Federal Alert, the bench in the plaza, the context of the message that had apparently just reached her. 30 seconds. Kaylin walked toward her, hand still in her jacket pocket, around the drive. Park didn't run, didn't reach for a phone. She stood with her tablet held in front of her like a shield that she knew wasn't a shield, and her eyes were doing the same thing trained people's eyes always did. Counting, measuring, deciding. 20 seconds. Kaylin stopped 2 feet in front of her and held out the drive. Park looked at it. 11 minutes of audio, Kaylin said. Graves's voice, explicit operational control statements, chain of custody documentation on the drive with it. She held the woman's gaze. You know what it's for. You know why I'm here. And you have about 15 seconds before that tactical asset behind me decides this looks like a threat. Park's eyes went to the asset, came back to Kaylin, measuring. You're Voss, she said. Yes. You understand if I take this. Everything I know about you says you take this and you call Holt, Kaylin said. I've been wrong about people before. If I'm wrong about you, then we're both standing in this plaza for no reason. She pushed the drive forward. But I don't think I'm wrong. 10 seconds. Park took the drive. The tactical asset's hand was on Kaylin's shoulder before she could turn. She let him take it. Both hands out, no resistance. The specific compliance of someone who had gotten what they'd come for and had no reason left to fight. The second asset was there in moments, and then the third, and the stone bench in the South Plaza of the Federal Building became the place where Kaylin Voss was taken into custody for the second time in 12 hours, with the morning sun cutting through the dissipating rain clouds above Manhattan, and the city moving around them with its characteristic absolute indifference. From the ground, with her cheek against the cold concrete and her hands being secured behind her, she could see Deanna Park's feet, standing still for a moment, then turning, then moving away, quickly, decisively, back toward the building's entrance, with the drive. Kaylin closed her eyes. The tactical asset said something into his radio, and the words were procedural and official and meant nothing to her at all. What she was tracking was the time, was the clock, was the 61 minutes that had been 61 when she left the building in Tribeca and were now closer to 40, and whether 40 minutes was enough for a woman named Deanna Park to get an audio file to a woman named Miriam Holt, before the paperwork on Evelyn Graves's desk crossed the desk of the National Security Advisor, and the concrete was cold against her cheek. She could feel the texture of it, the specific roughness of a surface that had absorbed decades of weather and foot traffic, and the slow accumulating weight of a city that never stopped moving. And she focused on that texture because it was real and immediate and required no decision-making. The tactical asset's knee was in her back, not hard enough to hurt, hard enough to communicate that resistance was no longer a viable option. Her wrists were being secured with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times and felt nothing particular about doing it again. Around her, the plaza continued its mourning. A woman with a stroller moved past on the far edge of the concrete, not looking. A man in a delivery uniform crossed the corner without breaking stride. The city processed the event of a woman being taken down in a federal plaza with the casual indifference it processed everything. As data that didn't require response, as background to the actual business of individual lives moving in individual directions. Kaylin kept her eyes on the spot where Deanna Park's feet had been. Empty now. Park was inside the building. Had been inside for approximately 40 seconds. She calculated. Elevator time from the south entrance to wherever Park's working space was. Time to insert the drive. Time to locate the audio file in the directory structure. Time to make the call to Holt's personal line. Time for Holt to receive and process and act, all of it dependent on variables she couldn't control from the concrete of a federal plaza with her hands secured behind her. She had done the thing she could do. What happened next was no longer hers. That understanding settled into her chest with a specific weight. Not defeat, not relief. Something harder to name than either of those. The weight of a person who has used up everything they had and is now required to wait and see if it was enough. The tactical asset pulled her upright. She didn't resist. She stood and felt the cold morning air on her face and looked at the federal building's glass facade and let herself be walked toward it with the quiet of someone who had, somewhere in the past 12 hours, stopped being afraid of what happened next. The holding room on the second floor was standard federal. A table, 2 chairs, a mirror that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. They'd taken the ankle piece, taken the burner phone, taken everything from her pockets, including the envelope from Carver's safe that she'd been carrying since Sunset Park. The envelope was in an evidence bag on the table in front of her, sealed. She sat and waited. The clock on the wall read 8:22, 38 minutes. A man came in at 8:26, not the tactical asset, someone different, older, in a suit that had been expensive several years ago, with the bearing of someone who had spent a long time in rooms like this on the other side of the table and was finding it instructive to be on this side. He sat down across from her and put a recorder on the table and looked at her with the expression of someone working out how to begin something complicated. "My name is Barden," he said. "I'm with—" "I know who you're with," she said. "I've been briefed on the IG investigation, the real one." He paused. "Solis." "Solis." He looked at the recorder, looked at her, made a decision she could see him making. A small adjustment in how he was sitting, a slight loosening of the formality he'd walked in with. "The recording reached Holt's office at 8:19, he said. She let out a breath that had been waiting somewhere in her chest since the plaza. "The designation paperwork is being held," he continued. "Holt is reviewing. It's not resolved yet. It's not resolved. But it's been flagged at the right level and the clock has effectively stopped." 8:19. 11 minutes after she'd handed Park the drive. 11 minutes. The same length as the recording itself. She thought about that. Thought about the specific symmetry of it, the way time had compressed and distended over the past hours, until minutes felt like different things depending on what they contained. Then she stopped thinking about it, because symmetry was not the point, and there was no comfort in patterns that didn't change outcomes. "The women," she said, "Yael's people, the 3 in Greenpoint. I don't have information on—" "Find out," she said, "right now before we talk about anything else. Find out if they're clear." Barden looked at her steadily. Then he picked up a phone on the wall behind him and made a call that lasted 90 seconds and mostly consisted of him listening. When he hung up, he sat back down. "2 are confirmed clear," he said. "The 3rd, there was a complication at a transit checkpoint. She was detained briefly. She's been released." He paused. "She's with the others now." Kaylin looked at the table. 3 women, alive and clear. On top of the 11 in the basement of Obsidian Saint, the 8 who'd been moved before the operation fully compromised, the other women whose names had been in Lucien's underground for 3 years. That math was the only math that had ever mattered. She looked up at Barden. "What do you need from me?" "Okay." The debrief lasted 4 hours. She gave him everything. Not the edited version, not the professionally curated account of a former federal agent managing her exposure. Everything. The 4 months of the Veil investigation, the false evidence architecture she'd been working inside, the names in the reports and what had happened to those names, Carver, the print shop, Fisk, the recording, Park, all of it. She told it without softening the parts where she'd been wrong, without reframing her own failures as the product of circumstances rather than decisions. She had believed in Wolf because she had wanted to. She had built the case against Lucian Vale with conviction because conviction had felt like integrity, and she'd confused the two. She had sent 12 names up the chain with the professionalism of someone who trusted the chain, and 8 of those names had paid for her trust in ways that she would carry for the rest of whatever her life turned out to be. Barden wrote and listened and asked clean questions, questions aimed at facts rather than the spaces between facts where culpability lived. He was good at this. Better than she'd expected. Somewhere around the 3rd hour, he pushed a photograph across the table. Fisk. A still from a security camera, time-stamped 40 minutes after the print shop, showing her walking into a building in Midtown. "We have her," Barden said. "The drive was recovered at 11:40. Intact. Where is she now?" "Federal custody. Real federal custody this time." "And Graves?" Barden was quiet for a moment. Graves became aware that Holt had the recording at approximately 9:15, he said carefully. "She left the federal building at 9:23. She has not been located." The word "yet" was absent from that sentence. Kaylin noticed its absence and what the absence suggested and filed it with the things she would think about later, in a different room when the immediate machinery of the morning had finished processing her. "Wolf," she said, "in custody. Has been since 6 this morning. Solis's office executed the warrant on him directly while you were in the plaza." She thought about Wolf. About 6 years. About the specific quality of trust given to someone who had built themselves to receive it, had built an entire version of you around it, had used your belief in them as the cleanest instrument they had. She thought about what it cost to dismantle that. Not the professional cost, not the institutional cost, the personal one. The version of herself that had believed in Adrian Wolf was not entirely gone, and the not entirely gone part of it hurt in a way that had nothing to do with what he'd done and everything to do with what she'd given him. She said nothing about any of this to Barden. They kept her in the building until 2 in the afternoon. Not in the holding room. After the debrief concluded, someone brought her to a standard office with a window that looked out over Broadway and left her with coffee that was better than the building's usual, which told her someone had made a decision about her status without telling her what decision they'd made. At 1:45, Solis came in. She looked like someone who had been awake for 30 hours, which she had, and was running on the specific fuel of a person whose long-running operation had just reached its resolution and hadn't yet processed what resolution felt like after 11 months of operating in sustained tension. She sat in the chair across from the desk and put her hands flat on her knees and looked at Kaylin without any of the particular masks that people wore when they came into rooms for professional reasons. "Holt stopped the designation," Solis said. "Permanently. The NSA's office issued a formal hold on any related designations pending IG review. It'll take months to unwind, but the corridor's federal protection is gone." "Graves," Kaylin said. "They'll find her." Solis's voice was flat. "She doesn't have the infrastructure she had 48 hours ago. Every financial channel is frozen. Every operational contact she had inside federal agencies is either in custody or being watched. She can run, but there's nowhere she can run to that isn't being covered." She paused. "Whether she surfaces in court or doesn't, that's a different conversation. But she's finished. The machine is finished." Kaylin looked at the window. Broadway below, moving the way it always moved, the ordinary commerce of a city that had been through whatever happened above its streets, and continued regardless. "The women," she said, "long-term. The IG's office is coordinating with a federal witness support unit that's been vetted clean, vetted by us, not by standard channels. Their documentation will be fixed, their identities secured." Solis paused. "It'll take time. It won't be easy for any of them, but they have a path now that they didn't have yesterday." Kaylin thought about Petra, sitting in the basement with a dog-eared novel and a paper cup of coffee. About Celestine, who had made coffee without being asked, and then spent 8 months feeding information to a federal investigation she believed was the better path. About the specific bravery of that, choosing to trust a system that had already failed you, because the alternative was trusting nothing, and trusting nothing was its own kind of destruction. She thought about Celestine for a long time. "She made the right call," she said finally. Going to your office. Solis seemed to understand without being told who she meant. Yes, she said quietly. She did. She didn't know that for certain when she did it. No. She did it anyway. Solis looked at her steadily. That's the only way any of this works, she said. Someone does the thing without knowing for certain it's the right thing, and then you find out. The office was quiet. My badge, Kaylin said. The offer that's coming. And I know it's coming because that's how this ends in the institutional version of events. The offer to come back. It'll come through Barden, Solis said. Probably tomorrow. I know what I'm going to tell him. Solis looked at her, not surprised, not trying to argue. Something else. A recognition, maybe. The look of someone who understood a decision they hadn't made themselves but could follow the path that led to it. Vale, Kaylin said. He's been processed and released. Solis's office confirmed his cooperation with the IG investigation as a material fact. It complicates any prosecution significantly. The DA's office will take months to determine if there's a viable case, and by then the political landscape looks very different. She paused. He's not under arrest. He's not under surveillance, officially. Kaylin stood up. Where are you going? Solis said. Not a challenge. A genuine question, asked in the tone of someone who understood that the answer mattered. Kaylin thought about it. I don't know yet, she said. Which was true, and wasn't the whole truth simultaneously. She picked up the evidence bag from the table. Barden had returned it to her after the debrief, the envelope from Carver's safe with the photograph inside, and walked to the door. Kaylin, she turned. Solis was still sitting with her hands flat on her knees, in the chair that was slightly too small for the weight the conversation had put in the room. For what it's worth, Solis said. What you did this morning in the plaza. She stopped, started again, and this time something cracked slightly in the professional surface of it. I've been running this operation for 11 months. I've made decisions that cost people things I can't give back. I've had to live with that the way you live with things that don't have resolution. She looked at Kaylin directly. This morning was the first thing in 11 months that felt like it might have been enough. Kaylin looked at her for a long moment. It wasn't enough, she said. It was what we had. That's different. She went through the door. Lucien was outside, not at the building's entrance, half a block south, standing in the cold afternoon light with his left arm in a proper sling that someone with actual medical training had apparently fitted for him, wearing a jacket that wasn't the suit he'd gone into the river in or the replacement from the garage. He was looking at the street the way he looked at everything, with the stillness of a man who had learned to treat waiting as a form of work. He saw her coming and didn't move toward her, let her close the distance at her own pace, which she recognized as a choice. She stopped beside him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The city moved around them, a bus grinding through a turn, a conversation in rapid Spanish from two men on the opposite corner, the smell of something being cooked in a restaurant whose ventilation was sending it directly into the street. The shoulder, she said. They stitched it 2 hours ago. He looked down at the sling briefly. 6 weeks, apparently. You should have had it done last night. I was occupied. She looked at the street. He looked at the street. Two people standing on a sidewalk in lower Manhattan, watching ordinary life conduct itself around the extraordinary things that had happened inside it. Celestine, she said. I know. His voice was quiet and careful. Barden told me. She made a judgment call. Yes, she wasn't wrong to make it. He was silent for a moment, a long moment, in which she could feel him working through whatever the cost of that was. The cost of 3 years of building something and trusting the people inside it, and the specific pain of finding that trust had been redirected rather than betrayed. That someone had chosen what they believed was the better path without telling him they were choosing. No, he said finally. She wasn't wrong. A pause. She was right, and it cost me a hard drive and 6 weeks of reconfiguring how I think about who knows what. Something in his voice that was dry and quiet and not without pain. That's survivable. Most things are, Kaylin said. He looked at her then, directly, with the full quality of his attention, that complete inventory she'd felt from across the bar her first night in Obsidian Saint, except this time there was no professional distance in it, no calculation being run about whether she was a threat. Just one person looking at another person at the end of something that had been enormous and asking a question without words. She looked back. "Barton's going to offer me my badge tomorrow," she said. "I know. I'm not taking it." He was quiet. "The system," she said. "The way it works. I understand it better now than I did yesterday. I understand that Soli spent 11 months inside it doing something real, something that mattered, and I understand that it cost her things she won't name. I understand that Barton is a good man operating in a structure that will occasionally require him to do things good men shouldn't do." She looked at the street. "I understand that the structure is not entirely corrupt and not entirely clean, and that the space between those two things is where most of the real work happens." She paused. "And I understand that I cannot go back into it, not because of what it did to me, because of what I now know about what I would have to do inside it to make it work." Lucien said nothing. He was listening the way people listened when they already understood and were giving you the space to finish. "The women who come out of what Graves built," she said, "the ones who survive it. They're going to need things the official system can't provide. Not because the system is malicious, but because the system has procedures, and procedures have edges, and real people fall through edges." She looked at him. "You've been building infrastructure for 3 years, infrastructure that works in the spaces the official system can't reach. It's not a stable operation right now," he said. "Obsidian Sane is compromised. Half my network is under scrutiny. The financial architecture needs to be rebuilt from—" "I know," she said. "I'm not talking about tomorrow. I'm talking about what comes next." He studied her. "You're not offering to help," he said. "You're telling me you've already decided." "I'm telling you I've already decided," she confirmed. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, not relief. Something more complicated than either. The look of a man who had spent a long time building something alone and was working out what it meant to not be alone in it, and whether that was something he knew how to do. "It's not safe," he said. "What I do, what we'd be doing." "I know what it is." She held his gaze. "I was in the river with you. I know exactly what it is." A long pause. "There are rules," he said. "How I run the operation, what we do and what we don't." "Tell me the rules." "We protect the people the system can't reach. We don't become the system. We don't make ourselves the authority. We don't create a structure that starts serving itself instead of the people it was built for." His voice was quiet and specific, the way it was when he was saying something he'd said to himself many times before saying it to anyone else. The moment it starts serving itself, we stop. "How do you know when that's happening?" "I've been asking myself that question for 3 years," he said. "I don't have a clean answer. I have a practice of asking it every time I make a decision." He looked at her. "Does that satisfy you?" She thought about it seriously, the way it deserved. "It's more honest than most answers," she said. He nodded once, small, precise. "There's an operation in Boston," he said. "A federal marshal selling witness locations to trafficking networks. I've had the documentation for 2 weeks, but not the federal architecture knowledge to move against it without triggering a response," she said. "Yes, I have that." "I know you do." Something that was almost the thing that came before a smile. "That's why we're having this conversation." She looked at the sky above Manhattan, the clouds from the overnight rain breaking apart in the afternoon, the specific pale winter blue of New York in November coming through in patches between the gray. The city below it unchanged and unchanging, processing its millions of individual dramas with the massive indifference of something that had seen everything before and would see it all again. 23 names. The original number she'd carried into this, the number she'd said aloud in an empty apartment while rain hit the window, because they deserved to be more than files. 15 bodies found, 8 more missing and unresolved. But Petra in a basement with a coffee cup. Celestine choosing to trust something because the alternative was choosing to trust nothing. Women in Greenpoint moving through transit checkpoints towards something that wasn't safety yet, but was closer to it than they'd been yesterday. The math didn't balance. It never balanced. That was the thing she'd learned in the past 48 hours that she hadn't fully understood before, that you didn't do this work because the math balanced. You did it because the alternative was knowing the math was broken and walking away from it, and walking away from it was a choice you made in your body, not your head. And her body had made it on a bridge in the rain when she'd gone over the barrier instead of stepping back. She'd been falling ever since. This, she thought, was what landing felt like. Not safe, not resolved, not the clean institutional closure of a case being closed and a badge being returned and a career resuming its trajectory. Just the ground under her feet and the cold air in her lungs, and a man standing next to her with a bullet wound in his shoulder, and 3 years of hard-built infrastructure that needed to be rebuilt, and a city full of people that the official machinery would not reach in time. She took out her phone, not the burner, the one Barden had returned to her, her actual phone, the one that still had the photographs of her old apartment and the contact list of everyone she'd known before this, and looked at it for a moment. Then she put it in her pocket. "Boston," she said. "Boston," he said. They stood on the sidewalk for another moment, two people at the edge of a decision that had already been made, taking the last second of the space before it became irrevocable. Not because either of them was uncertain, because irrevocable things deserved 1 second of acknowledgement before you stepped through them. Then Kaylin Voss started walking. Lucian Vale walked beside her, walked. The city moved around them, indifferent, enormous, full of the ordinary machinery of lives being lived and the hidden machinery of things being done in the spaces between those lives. Full of people who would never know what had happened in the past 48 hours or why the designation that had been on the NSA's desk at 9 o'clock this morning had never been signed. Full of women who would wake up tomorrow in different cities with different names and a path forward that existed because someone had chosen not to walk away from a bridge. Full of people who still needed what the official system couldn't give them, which meant the work was not finished. It had simply changed its shape. 3 days later, a congressional subcommittee convened an emergency session on the corridor. The testimony ran 9 hours and produced footage that aired on every major network. Former federal officials speaking with the specific, carefully managed remorse of people who understood they were trading information for lighter sentences. Financial disclosures that named names that had never been named in any public proceeding. Documentation of wire transfers, of witness eliminations, of a systematic program that had operated beneath the surface of federal power for 15 years. Adrian Wolf was present in the hearing room in the specific posture of a man who had prepared himself for a long time to sit in a chair like this and had found that preparation insufficient. Evelyn Graves was not present. A warrant had been issued across 47 jurisdictions. Interpol notification had been filed. The asset freeze had been confirmed in 11 countries. No body was ever found. Some believe she had fled on a private aircraft to a jurisdiction without extradition. Some believe she had called in a final favor from someone deep in the corridor's remaining structure and been given a new identity and a new country and the specific freedom of someone who had enough information about enough powerful people that eliminating her was more dangerous than letting her disappear. Others believed someone had made a different calculation entirely. The truth of Evelyn Graves existed somewhere in the space between those possibilities, where the hardest truths always lived. Too complicated for the clean version, too specific to be comfortable, too human to reduce to the binary of justice and its absence. Renata Solis testified on the third day of the hearings. She spoke for 4 hours in a voice that did not shake and did not perform either certainty or regret. She described 11 months of an operation that had cost her things she did not enumerate for the committee, that had required her to make decisions she did not justify, that had ended the way it had ended because of the actions of people she named specifically and the actions of people she did not name. When a committee member asked her directly about the agent whose cooperation had been central to the operation's final hours, Solis said, "I'm not able to speak to the current location or activities of former Agent Voss. What I can tell you is that without her specific knowledge and judgment, the recording that stopped the designation would not have reached the right hands in time. The outcome that this committee is currently examining would have been different." The committee member pressed. "Different how?" Solis looked at him steadily. "Significantly worse," she said. The hearings continued. The women moved through the witness support process, slowly, with the friction of any institutional process, but moving. Petra went to Portland. Celestine went to her family in another city and a debrief with the IG's office that lasted 3 days and ended with a handshake that was the closest thing to official acknowledgement she would ever receive. Others scattered to cities whose names would not appear in any public record, building lives whose shapes were entirely their own choices, which was the thing that had been taken from them and was now, incompletely and imperfectly, being returned. Maren Cole gave a recorded interview to Petra Nance that was released 6 weeks after the hearings concluded. She spoke for 2 hours about what she had seen and experienced and survived, and she spoke about Lucien Vale's operation with the specific clarity of someone who had been inside it and had made choices about it, and was now on the other side of those choices examining what she thought about them. He wasn't trying to be the system, she said at one point. He was trying to be what the system left gaps for. Those are different things. I didn't understand that at first. A pause. I do now. The interview received 4 million views in its first week. In Brooklyn, a former federal agent and a man with a healing bullet wound in his shoulder sat across a table from each other in a room above a laundromat and built something that didn't have a name yet. It wasn't a structure, wasn't an organization, was closer to a practice. The ongoing practice of asking the question Lucien had described on the sidewalk outside the federal building. Asking it every time a decision was made. Asking it especially when the decision felt obvious and righteous, because those were the decisions that created blind spots. And blind spots were where the things you were trying to fight took root. Some nights it felt like enough. Some nights it felt like a very small thing in a very large city with a very deep problem. On those nights, Kaylin stood at the window and looked at Manhattan across the water and thought about the specific arithmetic of small things, about Petra with her novel, about a drive that had reached the right hand's 11 minutes after it left hers, about a bridge in the rain and the choice she had made there, which had not been a heroic choice and had not been a strategic choice, but had been a human one. The choice to stay with the thing that was happening rather than step back from it. She thought about 23 names. She said them. Not as evidence, not as case files, not as the raw material of a prosecution or the justification for an operation or the weight she was required to carry, just as names, just as people who had existed and mattered and deserved to be spoken. When she finished, the city was still there, beautiful and corrupt and violent and alive, in the way cities were, the way things that contained everything simultaneously were, the way the world was when you stopped requiring it to be simpler than it was. Her phone buzzed. Lucien. Marshall in Boston. We have a window. Tomorrow morning. She looked at the message for a moment. Then she typed back. I'll drive. She set the phone down and stood at the window and let the city be what it was for another few minutes. Enormous and indifferent and full of the hidden machinery of things being done in spaces that official eyes couldn't reach. Full of people who needed what the system couldn't give them. Full of work. She was ready.